Hi, I'm Thorsten, and today we're going to talk about Bande, Dessinée and what this mini-series of 4 episodes is all about. So Bande Dessinée, what does that mean? It basically means drawn strip. In French, so that's French comics. You can also call them Franco-Belgian comics. Those are comics that are usually originally published in French and created for the readership in France or in Belgium. Many of the original artists and writers were from Belgium or from France. Those two countries have a long tradition in comics, and that's separate from the Western or American type of comics, and separately, obviously, from manga. So the reason why I picked Bande Dessinée is because I'm from Germany and European and grew up with some of those books. I grew up loving Asterix and the Smurfs and Lucky Luke, and got my hands on a couple of issues of Tintin that for that time in my life, being a young kid, were probably less interesting than Asterix. Especially the Asterix series got a big hype in Germany or in Europe in general through the movies, the cartoon movies that came out over decades and decades and are still part of like Easter television in Germany. For whatever reason, Asterix movies are usually shown around Easter, or they used to. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about the creators, some of those titles, and what I picked and why I picked those. But among the most popular Bande Dessinée comics are obviously The Adventures of Tintin by Hergé, Gaston Lagaffe by Franquin, Asterix by Grossigny and Uderzo, Lucky Luke by Morris, The Smurfs by Pijot, or Blake and Mortimer by Edgar P. Jacobs. So I want to have a little bit fun with this and change it up. I'm not going to give you my most favorite stories. I'm not going to give you a full overview of either the history or each series. But I want to overlay two things. I want to overlay Bande Dessinée, Franco-Belgian comics, with a category I picked, which is regions I lived in. That makes it personal to me and something unique that I want to explore here. Instead of Bande Dessinée, I could have picked manga or superhero comics, but I didn't. Instead of overlaying that with my personal residencies, I could have picked my favorite cities or themes like seasons, people, genres, and so on. There are many different options, but I picked this one and I'll stick to it. At times it might feel like square peg in a round hole because, spoilers, even though it's in the title, some of these only have a very loose reference to the location that is mentioned. And that's the only spoiler I'm going to give you, because I'm going to try to keep those overviews spoiler-free for your own enjoyment. So what did I pick and why? Let's start with Tintin. I can't make an overview of any Bande Dessinée stories without including Tintin. Hergé created Tintin in 1929 and then later on created the Tintin magazine, which was a main driver of why Franco-Belgian comics are as successful, still are to this day, as they've ever been. Without Hergé, there wouldn't have been any of the others. I don't think there would have been Asterix, there wouldn't have been Lucky Luke, there wouldn't have been Blake and Mortimer, there wouldn't have been the Smurfs. There's some titles I didn't include here. Again, for the reason that I mentioned, me overlaying it with regions I lived in. And the Smurfs, for example, I left the Smurfs out, even though they are definitely a big title in the BD universe. But the Smurfs hardly ever leave their forest. I haven't lived in a forest, so I felt it very difficult to include a Smurf book here. But a little bit about me first. I grew up, born and raised in Germany. when it was divided and occupied or besieged by the occupators, by the US, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. I grew up in West Berlin. I grew up in the French sector. That's the northwest of Berlin. That's where the French were. Below that, you had the American sector and the British sector. And then obviously East Berlin was besieged by the Soviets. When I was a kid, the wall fell. I grew up still in Berlin. And later on in my 20s, in my early 20s, I moved to Australia. So for 1 year, I lived in Australia. I traveled the East Coast. I lived most of my time in Sydney, spent some time in the Outback in Melbourne before I flew back after a year, moved back to Germany, went to university, and then came to the US. And since then, I live in California and trying to overlay my own residential history with those comics is super random. I'm aware of that, but it makes it fun. I had to find comics that have a reference to any of those 3 countries I've lived in and to make it work. So this is part 1 of a 4-part series. The other parts will be released at the first of each month following. So look forward to those. The order in which I will release them or discuss those books is also something that I had to make a decision on. I could have done those by publication date, by stories I like the most, or what I ended up with is the style. So we go from more cartoonist to more realistic in writing and in art. And I have ranked those as following. So today we are going to kick things off with Asterix and the Great Divide. It's the first one I picked. It is definitely the most cartoonish in storytelling and in art. And that's where we're going to start. Next month, we're going to look at Lucky Luke and the Wagon Train. Definitely one level up from Asterix. Not in quality, but in how realistic things are. Still very cartoonish, and but taking it up a notch in that direction. The third part will focus on Tintin and Flight 714 to Sydney. It's in the title. You already know what this is about, or you think you know what it's about, because, again, no spoilers for the book, but they're never going to end up in Sydney. But that's number 3. Before we are going to visit Blake and Mortimer in the 4th part of this series with 8 Hours in Berlin. Definitely the most realistic one in regards to storytelling and art. Also the most recent one, just being published a year ago in 2022, definitely tells a great story about the early 60s in Berlin. But more about that in 3 months from now when I'm going to release the 4th part. But let's kick things off today with Asterix and the Great Divide. The Great Divide being a reference to the Berlin Wall that came down when I was 6 years old. I still remember watching it on TV with my parents. The news were on, and they showed those pictures of people rushing to the wall and people from the East coming over. My parents and with their friends, we were at the friend's house talking about it when the news came on. I definitely at this point as a 6-year-old had no grasp on what that would mean moving forward. Could only go off what my parents were discussing with their friends, and definitely being aware that there was this other country close to my doorstep. Just a year or 2 prior to that, with my family, we actually visited the East just to see. It's like a 1-day field trip. In the morning, you cross the border, you come back. Luxury that obviously people in the East didn't have. But me being from the West, growing up in West Berlin, I was able to go as a, 4 or 5-year-old, must have been 5-year-old, because I can still remember it, but it had to be before the wall came down, visiting the East. And all I remembered from that time was like just the blandness of things. Things were great. There was no restaurant around. I think we went to Alexanderplatz back then, just looking around, doing sightseeing in a place where there was nothing. It was all gray. There were no restaurants. There were no shops, based on my memory. Um, but that's all I remembered from prior to the wall coming down. Obviously, when the wall came down, there were big fireworks. So I remember the fireworks that were to be seen from all points in Berlin. So they hosted like fireworks from all four sectors, and had spots on various hills where they hosted them and where they lit them up. So everyone in Berlin could see them, kind of as a sign, a statement of reunification, to have Berlin seen as one and become one by doing those fireworks. So I remember the fireworks and the announcement on TV way more than my trip to East Berlin prior to that. But in this comic, Asterix and the Great Divide, they're not actually in Berlin. They're still in the Gaul village in France. And if you're familiar with Asterix, each and every Asterix story starts off the same. There's basically this village in Gaul that resists the Roman Empire. The year is 50 BC. Gaul is entirely occupied by the Romans. Well, not entirely. One small village of indomitable Gauls still holds out against the invaders. And life is not easy for the Roman legionaries who garrison the fortified camps of Torturum, Aquarium, Laudantum, and Compendium. Probably butchered those names. Again, I grew up with that comic in German, and it's the first time of me reading those in English. So The Great Divide is the 25th Asterix comic. It was published in 1980, and it's the first Asterix adventure that was written by illustrator Albert Uderzo, to try out my French accent, following the death of Asterix co-creator and writer René Goscinny in 1977. It's in a Gaul village, just like the one we know. There are two chiefs who have divided the village into two halves. You have Cleverdix, who rules the west side or the left side, and you have Majestix, who rules the right side of that Gaul village. Again, that's not the village Asterix or Obelix are from, but a very like village neighboring theirs. As in so many other BD comics, you basically have the premise on the first page. So somewhere in Gaul, peace would be reigning in a little village, very like the village where Asterix lives. But in various particular incidents, a big ditch has been dug through the middle of the village so that no one can get from the right side to the left side. So that's the Berlin Wall right there, the reference to the Berlin Wall. And this book has references, obviously, to the Berlin Wall with the ditch that's dividing the village. And you got the comic effect of houses even being divided, which in reality is what happened. Families were being divided. I heard my mom telling me that when she was young, and she was like just my age, how old I was when the wall came down. That's the age she was when the wall was built. And her telling me stories about seeing families being divided, people jumping over the barbed wire fence, because initially when the wall was built, they didn't just start building a wall. They basically just pulled barbed wire fence through the streets, where later on the wall was going to be, where the different sectors of Berlin had been drawn. And you had barbed wire being pulled through the street. Families that were on one side and the other at this point had to make a decision. I remember her saying that her sister saw a couple being split apart, and then basically the guy had to jump over the barbed wire fence to be reunited with his girlfriend or wife. And those are things that happened all over the city. Like, again, you could work in one part of the city and live in the other, and suddenly they're going to divide it, block it off. First the barbed wire fence, then the first wall, then the second wall, because in the end you had two walls with the death stripe of death in between, der Todesstreifen in German. where you basically were free to be killed. East Berlin officers had the right to shoot you if you entered that part in between the wall. But Asterix picking up on that with the Great Divide that separates that village that is so very like the village we know. And you have the classic slapstick that you have in Asterix comics with the fights, the mass fights of the villagers just disagreeing. And here you have an example of the left and right side clashing. And then you have some Romeo and Juliet sprinkled in, because it's not only the two chiefs, but it's their son and daughter that are also intertwined here. So you have the daughter of Majestix, who is in love with the son of the other chief, Cleverdix. And Cleverdix gets wind of a plan that his counterpart has. And so he asks his old friend, Vital Statistics, for help. Vital Statistics, obviously the English name for our chief of Asterix village. And you get him asking for help here. And that's how our known protagonists, Asterix, Obelix, and Getafix, get involved in this story. So I don't want to give you spoilers. As I said, I'm going to keep those spoiler free. But you have that village being divided. One side asks Vital Statistics and Asterix and Obelix for help. And then the other side, you might have guessed, asks the Romans for help. And how that all pans out, you can find out for yourself. I like the story. Wasn't the best Asterix comic I've read, but it was a decent one. You have the Romeo and Juliet reference here with the kids of each chief being in love. And find out for yourself if the divide holds up or not. This being written in 1980, the wall was still up. It was still 9 years until the wall fell. So with regards to the historical reference, that's still in there. You have Uderzo, who again is the writer and illustrator of this book. For the first time he's writing it himself after Grossigny died. But you definitely have his commentary in here of what he thinks of the wall or of the divide. You have commentaries that this is the stupidest idea he's ever heard. Gaul saying that through him. And yes, that is true. That's why it didn't last. But check out Asterix and the Great Divide. So I'm going to see you next week when we're going to talk about Lucky Luke. Until then, so long.